Hi, everyone, and welcome. It's great to have all of you here with us, and we're going to get started. I'm Maureen Droney with the Recording Academy Producers and Engineers Wing, as many of you know. We are very pleased to be co-hosting with Dolby this special Atmos Music Masterclass. This is the first of what's planned to be a series of Inside the Mix episodes on everything immersive, from deliverables to room configurations, tuning, and my favorite topic, metadata. Presenting today are two people many of you also know, Carrie Thomas, whose title is Content and Studio Enablement for Dolby Music, and Michael Romanowski, who is the owner of Coast Mastering and a multiple-time Grammy nominee in the Best Immersive Audio Album category. We're going to spend about 30 minutes on the presentation, and then we've got another 30 minutes allocated for Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll have a good amount of time to answer them. Now I want to introduce you to someone else that many of you may know, or should if you didn't, Christine Thomas, who is Dolby's Head of Music Partnerships.
Thank you so much, Maureen. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you today. We deeply appreciate the relationship with the Recording Academy and the P&E Wing, and are thrilled to be delivering this series together for all of you to delve deeply into the details pertaining to Dolby Atmos for music and also answer your questions head on. This series will include several of our experts throughout each session. And with that, I will just welcome Mr. Romanowski to join us on the stage.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to all those that are able to attend in person and those that will be watching this at a later date. This past year has brought about an explosion of immersive audio to the world. Many of you here have been working in surround for some time, and now even more recently in immersive audio. I built my first surround mastering room in 2001, for example, and added Dolby Atmos mastering capabilities in 2018. But this big explosion that I'm talking about is not only from the public's perspective, but also the creative community. This came in 2021 when Apple and other music distributors started streaming immersive audio. This freed the consumers from the limitations of physical media and providing an opportunity for many more music fans to be able to listen to immersive audio without necessarily needing a complicated multi-speaker setup. Now that the world is getting accustomed to both the experience and the creative process around recording, mixing, mastering, and distributing immersive audio, we of the P&E Wing of the Recording Academy wanted to bring to you a series of informational sessions to our members. The first presentation will be with Carrie Thomas discussing, as you can see in the chart, some deliverables, file types, references, and some other best practices. And other conversation. And as a reminder, we're going to leave open room for discussion and Q&A at the end of the presentation. This is where you come in. But I also wanted to start out by thanking Maureen Droney and her amazing staff, and to the P&E Wing Steering Committee for helping bring this series to you. Also, a huge thank you to Christine Thomas and all she's done to help bring this forward, and to Carrie Thomas, who's participating today, and everyone else from Dolby who will be bringing these presentations to you at a later date. Building upon this first presentation. We want to thank you for your generosity and your time and expertise in donating, that you are donating to this esteemed group to help us get a better foundation and a better understanding of the principles and process of Dolby Atmos music. And with that, thank you again for being here. And I would love to bring on Carrie Thomas. Carrie, let's get started.
Thanks so much, Michael. Yeah, it's great to be here, and very happy that it's not just going to be me talking for the next 6 episodes of this series. So thanks for allowing us to partner with you on this, and away we go. So
awesome.
Let me put my screen up here. So many of you will be familiar with all the topics that we're going to discuss, and this series is really inspired by the questions that many of you send in, have asked over the years in different formats and forums, and very definitely wanting to get the information clear out to you folks, because you educate the entire industry. So Before we dive in here, Michael mentioned physical media, and while the headlines for Dolby Atmos music are around streaming, it is also, and in fact started with distribution of physical media, so Blu-rays, etc. I'm going to talk generally about the deliverables today, but my colleague Mike will go into many deeper aspects of the formats surrounding this, including True HD, in other sessions. And as you are probably aware, but for those of you that may not be, Dolby Atmos is a scalable format. So it's not about 714, 914, the particular setup that's in your room. It will scale to the capabilities of a device and an environment. In order to help you get set up with Dolby Atmos in your studio, we have some resources that are available. So you'll see the QR codes dotted throughout. If you point your cell phone camera at the QR code, it will take you right to these useful links. So listening over speakers is key and critical to the success of making sure that you know what you're putting into the world. Dolby's role is then to make sure that is going to translate into what the client hears and thus onto the consumer. We're going to cover some of these topics as we go through this session here, but definitely reach out, help us to help you get set up for Atmos content creation. Delivery specifications, there's a number of methods out there to get this information. This document is actually provided by Dolby to our label partners, to the DSPs providing the service. And the highlights of it, there's a lot in the document, but the highlights of it that are that masters should be delivered as an ADM B-Wave. 96K projects should be delivered as a DAMF. Masters should have binaural render modes specified for each bed and object. Well, what are beds and objects? Well, let's take a quick brief tour into that. So beds are the channel-based component. So behind Michael, you see his left speaker, his left wide speaker, his left side speaker. The channel component of that means that we can get to the left side and we can get to the left speaker, but we can't get to that left wide. The objects cover all of the space within that. So you can pan throughout the sound field and maintain the intention of the audio that's being put into that. They also have the ability to be controlled by different binaural render modes. And those metadata parameters will be covered in David's session later on. The integrated loudness should not exceed -18 LKFS. What we're giving back to the community here is dynamic, is headroom, dynamics. We want to ensure that music is allowed to live and breathe in its natural form. So that's a high-level delivery specification. So I'm going to start by kind of taking a walk through some of the best practices that we see developing for music creation. A lot of the data that's been out there is quite old. We're seeing the workflows evolve all of the time. And so just definitely wanted to take this opportunity to kind of level set where we are today, 2022 March. And this is hopefully going to be useful for the community.
Eric, can I ask you a question real quick? Can we want to real quick back and forth to explain something you talked about a second ago? We were talking about so the space actually between and objects and beds and being able to get in between, as you're alluding to best practices and how we're moving forward with figuring out the best ways to represent these. Can you talk just a little bit about the representation in those fields of objects and beds and how they may play out in things like sound bars or places that have fewer speakers but the ability to decode?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mike will go into it far deeper in the formats and other sessions going forward. But basically, the intention of Dolby Atmos is to preserve what you hear in the studio through into the devices. So it's going to try and maintain the power and location of an object source, in fact, a channel source also, whether it's playing off of a soundbar in a car, over a laptop, or over headphones in many different formats and forms. That's what Dolby Atmos is. It's a translation mechanism. So what you put into it in your studio, you need to be confident of. Listen over the speakers, listen over the headphones, and then Dolby kind of take the burden to get it through to the consumer device in its greatest possible way. So hopefully that answers your question.
Appreciate it. Thank you for being a little bit more descriptive. Actually, and one other thing you had on your slide there, if I can allude to again real quick, is that 96K files and DAMP files being the delivery. And we'll talk about the meaning of what all that is, later on in subsequent sessions. But as a best practice, would you recommend that folks that have sessions that are currently in records that are working at 96K continue to do so? Or what would you recommend, knowing what the future might bring or where we are right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'd absolutely recommend maintaining the highest quality possible. We're in a moment right now where there's a lot of attention being put on catalog work and various other things. So if you've got tape-based transfers, or higher resolution sessions, maintaining the sample depth and bit depth of those sessions as far along the chain as possible is going to be valuable to you. So today you can take a 96K DAMP file and encode it for True HD for Blu-ray distribution. But for streaming, the ADM-B wave is the distribution mechanism. And you can actually export that directly from the many workstations today. And this is a good way to fit in with one of those delivery requirements of it matching the stereo file that's going along with it. So if you've got your stereo reference file or your stereo mix, making sure that the ADM file that you're delivering is matching that length is part of that delivery specification. And so having the ability to direct export from a workstation timeline is something that has been beneficial to many of you, I know. Unfortunately, it is limited to 48K files. So in those instances where you're working with a larger or a higher sample rate session, so 96K is the maximum capability of the renderer. And you have to print into the Dolby Atmos renderer in real time for those higher sample rates. Definitely worth the time. It's almost certain that you're going to find something you want to change on that final print down. So monitoring it one last time is not a bad thing. But it's definitely something that has to be done in our Dolby Atmos renderer. It's not supported today, as we stand here today, in the exports from the workstations. So that Dolby LTC generator can actually help with this. And that workflow will be covered with some of my colleagues in the creation solutions session. So look out for that coming your way. Again, best practice. Sorry.
I just said appreciate it. Thank you for touching on that, because I think that's especially given the fact that now, and I'll just say it, with Apple accepting 96K files, many other streaming services have allowed higher resolution for a long time. Now that's the norm, not the exception. And many people have been working in 96K, let's say, for a number of years. And exactly to your point of, looking at catalog records or things that were recorded to tape, the opportunity to convert them to digital files, you would always want to do the highest resolution possible, or something that is going to work. So the fact that that's a possibility and they can keep their workflow moving forward, fantastic. So thanks for that. Cool.
Yeah. So the unsexy name of this next slide is program level metadata. So program level metadata as it's referred to in a number of the workstations, are things like trim and downmix controls, binaural settings. They're things that are static through the duration of a file, and should be thought about up front, potentially the same throughout the entire album. As we're here today, it should be the same for the whole album to maintain the same downmix if you're not listening to an Atmos setup. And that downmix stops at 5.1 for the streaming services. The intentional stereo, as Michael refers to it, is what's delivered on all of those streaming services today. So important to make sure this is set, but don't worry, we're not just throwing away your stereo files. These trim and downmix controls are for getting from a full Atmos system or a soundbar that's capable of Dolby Atmos and playing back on smaller experiences. So if you don't have overhead speakers, but you are in a home theater environment, these trim controls will actually allow you to define what that experience is going to be. My personal preference is for the direct render mode for the 5.1. And basically that's going to pull things overhead down and maintain the horizontal sound field to the best of its capabilities. There's another one, direct render with room balance. That room balance is going to push everything from not in the LCR towards the rear of the room in those 5.1 experiences. So that's my preference, and then low-row from that. So the traditional stereo downmix from stereo, stereo downmix from 5.1 is referred to as low-row. So David will go into this a little more in the session on metadata, but very useful to be able to find these.
I was actually just going to ask you that. Is there, and David will go into a little bit more, because I know some folks that are attending this are going to have questions about how exactly, what's the math, or maybe what's happening with the height and incorporation. Is there any timing changes? Are there any, what are the details that going to know that how these calculations are done to maintain integrity? Is that on Dave? Is that something we'll talk about?
We seek to maintain that. Certainly the timing is not affected in that. So we're going to preserve the arrival time at the listening position the best we can. Levels, trim is definitely going to be manipulated by yourselves. So in the default mode, it pulls down, if I recall correctly, -3 for the surrounds and -6 for the overheads. You can define that, and that will actually pass through the whole encode. So definitely worth monitoring those things as well. And then the binaural render modes can be either set in the binaural window in the renderer or via the binaural settings plugin. And we'll go into this a little more in other sessions as well. Make unused objects inactive. So this is one that says, okay, let's not waste space, but also it helps as you go through the whole production chain. So if you're sending a file to a mastering engineer such as Michael, then they're not going to be have their timeline filled with silent objects, and it's very definitely worth doing this. There's two places.
It's worth noting, I had a client, and I'll say this, and I think he's probably watching, and so I'm not going to call him out because he, and so this is a little nod to him, but the questions that do come up are, I've had folks, and he wasn't the first one actually, but asked, well, if I have 10 songs and I'm using 60 objects on all, should I have the same number of objects on every song within the album, whether I'm using them or not? So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah. I always say storage is cheap, but it is definitely a workflow enhancement as well. So yeah, very, very, very much important. So we've got 10 minutes left in the presentation portion of this, so I'm going to try and knock through pretty quick here. Assign descriptions in groups. So this is something that's not necessarily always done in the sessions, but this is our kind of methodology for helping to keep track of what's on particular channels, and you know, for those of you that have received sessions where it's audio 1, audio 2, audio 3, it will actually help you to keep these things organized. So by setting up groups in your sessions, you can actually bundle together sets of objects and beds, and those can be used to define re-renders, which we'll talk about. But you can also use the description field, and that's actually going to give you labels for the files and for the individual channels as it goes into a new workstation, but also for archiving. Like if you want to get into a session later on and pick it apart or remodel it in some way, then you know that's going to help you to find where that vocal is and the delay for it. So very definitely worth digging into what those descriptions can provide for you.
I'm really glad you said that. And I know time frame is that things go by fast. I don't, you know, but I think I'm really glad you said that, because we all think we're going to remember what things are. And archiving is a huge, as these things move forward, looking at longevity, I can remember 6 months or a year or 2 years from now what things, you know, are, if you have to go back and make an adjustment. Consequently, same thing, following the path all the way through. By the time it gets to a mastering engineer and somebody's got a question about something specific, you can go directly to it with proper naming conventions and best practices. So thank you. And I do want a quick reminder, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat so we're prepared when we get to that section. Thanks, Carrie. Carry on.
Cool. So how do you actually create these files? Well, the Dolby Atmos exports are actually set up from the file menu. So they're exported from the file menu. So once you've created your master file, you go into File, Export Audio, and then you've got options for re-renders, ADM B-Wave, IMF IAB, which is not used for music. It's a deliverable for OTT streaming platforms such as Netflix, Amazon, Apple TV, and then the MP4. And they're actually defined in the window menu though. So if you click on the window menu, you'll find the input configuration, the ability to set up re-renders, define binaural render modes, those trim and downmix controls. And for those of you that may not be aware, we do in fact have an offline loudness analysis. So it's available once you've printed the master. You can check that loudness as well. So very worth being aware of. So let's dive into the file types and their purpose. Right. So you hear all of these terms: the DAMF, the MP4, the ADM, the bin file or binaural file. But let's take a look at what they are and why and how they can be used. And we're going to start with the MP4. So the MP4 is primarily used for QC workflows. So once you've created your mix, you want to know how it's going to sound on various devices. It was put into the renderer so you could print a session out and play it on a home theater system, so that you could hear what it was going to decode like in that kind of speaker-based playback. It's also now used for Apple Music headphone experience. So putting into the Files application, there's a really cool workaround I'm going to get to in a moment here. But awesome. That's the DD Plus Jock codec. And that's a Dolby Digital Plus. It's a lossy codec, but has high quality compression on it. It's designed for speaker-based playback, so it doesn't include the binaural metadata. You can load it on
768, correct?
Yeah, it outputs at 768 kilobits per second for music. So if you select the music profile in the MP4 export, it's only going to do 768. If you do the film profile or the video profile, then it's going to give you the option for 448 or 768. I highly recommend not doing that for the music tracks, because it does affect how the loudness is measured. because post-production values for loudness are treated differently. So we're not taking integrated loudness, we're taking things like the short term and all the dialogue weighting into that as well. So useful to be aware of that.
Thanks for that. Awesome.
So this MP4 zip workflow is really useful for those of you that may have struggled to talk somebody through getting files installed on their iOS device and all of the configurations. This actually came from Mike Dean. He came up with this workflow about 2 days after installing his Atmos room and put me to shame. So congratulations, Mike. It's been really, really useful. The binaural re-render. So the binaural re-render is, again, predominantly used for QC workflows. So it should not be delivered for distribution. It is PCM, so anything that will play a stereo file will play this binaural re-render. And it does have all of the binaural effects that you're putting in for your, controlled by your binaural render modes. And it's designed to be used for QC of services that use the Dolby binaural decoding. In order to,
do you want to real quick? Do you want to? Sorry, Carrie. Real quick. Do you want to say who those are? Like who currently is using the Dolby binaural as forward-facing to the consumer?
Yeah. So currently, and you know, Tidal launched with this in December of 2019, if I recall correctly, on Android. Recently, Amazon Music expanded their offerings and use of Dolby Atmos, which included using our Dolby binaural across all of the devices that they support. I think there are some outliers in that, but predominantly, if you've got a iOS, Android device that's capable of using Amazon Music, it's going to be decoding in the application for that. So yeah, there we go.
Great.
So for those of you who want to evaluate what that's going to be and send to your customer, you can create a re-render type of type bin. You do that in the window menu, re-renders, and that's really useful functionality. And the re-renders is something that I definitely encourage you to dive into. Particularly if you're preparing a session that may end up with a performance on Saturday Night Live. You can have a mix minus that is derived exclusively from your Atmos mix and in a 514 format, so that it's going to allow the singer to perform, but you've got your full immersive Atmos mix that you created in the studio. So useful functionality. And if you're thinking about Atmos first workflows, then you can actually create stems of different channel formats so that you can manipulate them further to actually get your stereo mix from the intention of the Atmos mix as well. Definitely not suggesting you can take the Atmos mix and immediately deliver stereo, but the functionality there to allow you to manipulate that is really pretty powerful. So you'll see there it's defined by full mix as well. Those groups that you set up in I'll add in the descriptions can actually be used as custom groups in there. So if you wanted to say, I want my delays and my reverbs as part of one group, you can do that. Where you want to keep your guitars and your pianos separate, you can create stems from the Atmos mix. So very useful to dig into. The binaural re-render, as I mentioned, can be played back on any device capable of PCM output via headphones. It does, unfortunately, get affected by the iOS 15.2 introduction of spatialized stereo. So if you are not quite getting what you expect and it feels a little reverby on top of your binaural export, that's probably what's happening. So if you swipe down from the control center on your iOS device, press and hold on the volume control, you'll get to this screen, which allows you to turn off spatialized stereo. It's very disconcerting for the first time you hear it.
Indeed. Do you want to say anything about real quick about the spatialized, about what happens if somebody's listening through? So rather, and I love the new tip. Thank you for that, and for getting folks to listen to. But the listening in the Files app, what happens when you if you're listening to an MP4, how turning that spatialization off is different from the real world.
Yes, thank you.
Consumer world, I should say.
That's a yeah. You don't live in the real world.
We don't live in the real world. No, haven't for a long time.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. It's a good point. So the in the services that are streaming Dolby Atmos, if you turn off Dolby Atmos capability or spatial audio or whatever your service is referring to it as, it will actually play a different stream. It will play the stereo stream that's going alongside of it. That's not the case when you're doing these preview workflows. So if you have the MP4 and you're playing it through Files and then you turn off spatial audio, it will play the 5.1 folded down to stereo thing that's going on. It is not representative of what will happen in the, to use Michael's word, the real world. So be aware of that, and be confident that we've got you back on that. So
yeah, in this world and this meeting, the real world being the intentional stereo mix that people work really hard to create, as well, and have to submit along with this. We just don't have at the moment the tools for the one-to-one comparison in that particular space.
Correct. So so I've said what the delivery files are not. They are not the binaural. They are not the MP4. But what actually are they then? Well, as I mentioned, we have the ADM B-Wave, which is the audio definition model broadcast wave. That's a PCM-based codec. It's got the binaural metadata, it's got the trim metadata, it's got the 48K capability, and 24-bit. So that's got everything you need for QC purposes at labels, mastering houses, wherever that might be, and distribution. You can also send it for distribution of those physical medias. So it will encode as true HD from an ADM B-Wave. The secondary deliverable these days is the DAMF, the Dolby Atmos master file. And it's really for the higher sample rate projects, as we mentioned. It's actually a core audio file that is the codec for that. It does contain all of the other things and is capable of 96K or 24-bit. So if you're in a 96K world, you would be delivering that DAMF to the label. You can convert a DAMF to 48K ADM using the Atmos conversion tool, which is a free download from our website. And that will help you to get everything that you need done. But the ADM B-Wave and the Dolby Atmos master file are the only two files you should ever need to deliver to a label or a distribution partner. They may ask you for the QC files, but the actual truth is the ADM and the Dolby Atmos master file are the only things you truly need.
Gary, is there any advantage? Sorry, is there any advantage to delivering a DAMP file over an ADM if it's at 48K? I mean, is there any? Okay.
No advantage.
Nothing
whatsoever.
different.
It's in fact, it's a distinct disadvantage because the DAMF is made up. It's actually a file package. It's made up of a .atmos file, .atmos.audio, .atmos.metadata. That file is basically the end of the line without converting back to an ADM. So if you convert it to an ADM, you can then import it into another workstation for mastering or for album assembly or any of those sort of things. The DAMF is kind of it's the endpoint file. So you have to be certain that everything's right in it, or it's already in a long play session, or whatever that might be.
Gotcha. Thanks for that. Because sometimes I get either one as far as files coming to me, and knowing what the advantages or disadvantages of each one to communicate with clients and folks. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. So with that, we've reached the end of the presentation portion. I think I'm a few minutes over. Sorry, Candice, but I'll stop my screen share. Invite Christine back to moderate the Q&A. And Michael, it's showtime.
Showtime. Well, thank you, Carrie. Thank you for that discussion. I know that there's going to probably a whole bunch of questions, and we want to bring Christine Thomas back on to field and moderate the questions that have come into I said chat earlier. I meant to say Q&A. So if anybody still has questions to ask, please hit the Q&A section, not the chat side of things, because we've locked that out. You weren't going to get anywhere. So Christine, thanks, Carrie. Christine, welcome back.
Thank you so much. Great job as usual, guys. Appreciate that. So we do have a few questions in the queue, and I'll just start at the top. Rafa Sardina asked, regarding sample rates, what would be the case for other sampling rates besides 48K and 96? Currently, I'm working on an 88.2K project.
Michael.
Rafa,
I mean, he went straight for it.
Hey man, how you doing? Let's talk. I would take the 88.2, yes, and that was a big thing for a long time of folks knowing they were going to go to CD and doing integer math to get to 44.1. If this is a legacy product or project that was already at that, and you're going somewhere else with it, my advice would be go up to 96 and work with that, so that future versions of, rather than going down to 48. You're going to have to go one way or the other, because this is based on video frame rate. And so we have to base it on a 48K frame rate and multiples of. Whether we get to 192 in the future, who knows? But I think you need to stay around a 48K based. So my suggestion, recommendation would take the project to 96 and continue on from there. Probably going to happen if you're doing this stereo simultaneously. So you're going to want a 96K version of the stereo also.
You're also protecting your archive, if I can just add that, right? We know that that's what the labels are wanting to archive, so that you're future proofing.
Absolutely, moving forward that way, right? Exactly. 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, who knows? Now, always better to have more.
Yep.
Okay, and
Carrie, do you have any additional thoughts, Carrie, on that?
More bits are better.
More bits better.
Andrew Chefs asks. Yeah, Andrew Chefs asks, can you please explain the difference between low-row and LTRT?
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Andrew.
That's you, Gary.
So LTRT stands for left total, right total, right? And so it's actually a matrixed format that enables you we're actually using the ProLogic 2 version of LTRT to derive from it an individual channel for surround. So LTRT in non-ProLogic has a standard, has a single surround field, so it's LCRS. And once you feed LTRT into a decoder, it will actually give you LCR, LSRS. It won't give you the LFE component of that. And in fact, in the low row as it stands today, the LFE is also discarded. But one of the reasons that we recommend not feeding song critical elements into the LFE. It is an extension, it is an effect, it is not a place to store your kick drums. So be very cautious of that.
Great, thank you.
Let me follow up with that real quick. Carrie, can you talk about, so LFE, hey Andrew, thank you for the question. LFE, can you talk about some best practices with the LFE for a second? Because that there's, exactly to your point, it's not a repository for the low frequencies. And how do we handle, it and its translation to other formats or other experiences like headphones, et cetera? Yeah,
so in the headphone experiences, so in our Dolby Atmos binaural, it's rolled in to the left and the right at 4.5 dB per ear. And the LFE is treated as an off object, so there is no spatialization on that.
It is, however, a full range channel.
It is a full range channel. So treating the LFE on the way into the renderer is critical, because while you may not be able to hear it in your room, either because the speaker itself has a filter on it, or your room calibration has added a 120, 130 low pass filter on the output channel. If you just feed the content straight from a Pro Tools panner, for example, into the LFE, it's going to go through completely unfiltered. So you're going to waste space, you're going to waste energy, and potentially damage your equipment. So on professionalsupport.dolby.com, you'll find some knowledge base articles that actually define adding a high pass filter as well as a low pass filter. The high pass filter I set at about 20 hertz, really clears out all of that junk that you can't actually hear down there, but can damage equipment. And then the low pass, a 6 dB per octave at 120 is totally fine. You can go higher for the angle as well. So yeah, if you prefer a 15 or a 24 dB per octave, totally fine with that as well. So.
Okay, great.
Cool, thanks. I think that's one of those one of the perception differences I think that people hear if they're not filtering the LFE, that when they make a headphone file, realizing it in a binaural or so, that there are frequencies that may hit the LFE that are maybe getting in the way or causing some phase or some other relationship issues with frequencies that are, it's not meant to be there, but it can skew the QC or the referencing process.
Yeah. Hey guys, we have quite a few questions in queue. We're going to have to move a little bit fast. So just to jump in, is there a way to have real-time monitoring of how our mixes will ultimately sound once they're listened to on Apple Music? Mr. Thomas, will you please address this?
Yes. So with the latest version of Logic Pro, if you run it on Monterey, you can actually live audition what that would be. I just wrote an article for LinkedIn about this. It's called Workflow Impact for Logic Pro Spatial Monitoring or something along those lines. Very catchy. It gives a kind of description of some of the workflows that you can utilize. Yeah, it's very much, we create Dolby Atmos in the renderer, and we do the best we can to get that into the distribution chain.
So similar, well, not similar, but along the same line of discussion, can all professional processes, delivery formats, etc., be done in Nuendo, or is Pro Tools the only way to go?
Absolutely. So we've got wide and pretty deep support in Nuendo, in Pro Tools. Pyramix has just released version 14, which is a significant upgrade. And we're seeing that roll out. So Logic Pro can import and export ADMs and perform all of those functions. And then for workstations that aren't yet Dolby Atmos enabled with deep integration, we have the Dolby Atmos Music Panner. So if you want to use FL Studio to create your Atmos mixes, I'm not saying you'll get a ton of support, but it will work. So yeah.
I don't know if you said DaVinci Resolve also. You mentioned some of the other DAWs, but there's also that handles it well. You guys are working closely with them. Nuendo user myself, works great, but it's not just a Pro Tools only.
So a couple of other things, and we have follow-up questions on these. So I'm going to circle back just to make sure everyone knows I'm seeing those. But let's go back to the top here from Todd Burke. Some of us, after completing an Atmos album mix, have been opening the mix ADMs into a session in order to assemble the album alongside the original stereo mix and timestamp the outgoing ADM. Is this necessary? It's a real hassle. Fair enough. Or is it just as well to ensure the outgoing ADMs are the same length as the stereo masters only?
So I'm sorry to say, Todd, that I have to, pulling it into the session or stamping them with the correct time code is absolutely my preference for it, and I think it's the way that it should go. Down the line, if somebody picks up the project from you, they don't have to know that a particular song was track 3 on an album if it slots nicely into the timeline because of the pre-stamped metadata. So yeah, it's a hassle. It's something that can be improved in the workflow, and one of the things that we're always doing is improving the workflow. So hopefully you've seen that over the course of the last 2 or 3 years. But yeah, that's definitely something that can be improved.
Definitely vouch for that, and listening to requests from folks who are working every day in this, looking for things to help improve workflow so we can focus on the creativity. My hope is in the future we get to, as we're used to dealing with PQ and metadata and even ISRC codes and things like that, that we'll get into being able to treat and work with Atmos files similarly to as we do with stereo in a production and delivery field. But we're in a growing field. So patience, folks.
There's a related question to this topic. Is there a way in the future where track names can be included with ADM B-Wave import to Pro Tools via session import data or other DAW? Currently, the tracks take the name of their object number plus the potential of the renderer group names.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much dependent on which workstation partner you're working with. The functionality is there from a Dolby's perspective. So it's a case of how they wish to implement that. So Nuendo, for example, has long had a 5.0 object panner or a 7.0 object panner, whereas others are still on maximum of stereo. That capability, and as we've seen with Logic Pro, it automatically pushes the file name. So it's a case of each workstation developer deciding on how they want to represent that. It's not a Dolby decision.
If I may add, a best practices is if you're starting a session, because of the way these things pull in, if you're starting a session, no matter what workstation you're working in, but if you import an ADM file and they're not labeled, it'll just say audio 1, audio 2, audio 3. If you bring in multiple sessions within that same folder, those audio files can get corrupt because they're not, or they could get confused in certain circumstances because they are not identified necessarily with that project. They only say audio 01, etc. So make sure and keep your project, each song as separate projects so that your files stay within that project. One, for ease of use and clarity, but the other is when you move that somewhere else or you archive it, everything goes with that and you know that you have what you need.
Good. Do you not have to print in real time in the renderer when you're running at 48K?
No, you do not.
Okay. Is there work?
Was that Ryan's question?
No,
so
in Pro Tools, in Nuendo, and I'm pretty sure in some of the other workstations, you can offline bounce, so non-real-time export straight to an ADM B-Wave that is Dolby Atmos capable. So
terrific.
I will say there's definitely a benefit of bouncing non-real time like that if you can in some of these workstations is it gets rid of some latency, or it gets rid of some tops and tails perhaps on the file that some workstations may introduce to make sure nothing gets cut off, which means they don't necessarily sometimes not match the stereo file. So there's actually a more accurate balance by doing it internally than it is doing externally for timing purposes.
Terrific. Ryan Elliott asks, if not the kick drum bass toms, what do you use the LFE for in music?
The kick drum, bass, and toms can go to the LFE. They just shouldn't be relied upon exclusively. So there's harmonic information for all of those instruments that can be beneficial to go into the LFE, but it should never be used exclusively for an element that is critical to the song's success. There's just go tangential here. There's a story in post-production of the first time that the team at Skywalker heard the Jurassic Park mix coming through an LTRT decode, and there was no T-Rex footstep. because it had all gone into the LFE. Don't do that.
Good. So I think there are a couple of meaty topics here that we should make sure we get to before we're up here today. Ari Morris asks, and I love that you're here working with us on this program, Michael. What is the role of a mastering engineer in Dolby Atmos? How necessary is it? As many of the labels are not using Atmos mastering, but I just want to, if I can, just take a quick, before you jump in, quick stab at this, because I want to clear up the last piece of this, which is about what the labels are doing. There was how things began, because out of necessity, let's say, there was a particular approach taken, and there is the evolution of that process. So Michael, can you fill us in a little bit more, because I know you've been directly involved in this from the beginning with us.
Thank you. Yeah, I just, as I would say, a 10,000-foot view of mastering is, it's always been the final check of QC. It's always been the point of reference to refer back to engineers. Is everything going to translate well? Giving them information on their mixes about how something may translate outside of a particular environment. It's also about creating the deliverables and making sure that everything is spot on in the last chance before distribution to make sure there aren't any issues. So beyond solving problems or identifying things that may gum up the works moving forward, the perception aspect of it is no different than mastering stereo. As a matter of fact, I would say, and I would certainly argue, and thank you, Christine, I've been doing this for a long time, that I think it's necessary. It's even more so than the stereo world, because there are more channels. There's more opportunity for things to go wrong. There's more opportunity for things to get mistranslated, mislabeled, put to the wrong direction. Changing dynamics. We want to get into some of the processes we work with. In immersive audio, the more that one tries to compress, different from the stereo world of looking for that, unfortunately, the loudness side of things and that thing in the center of your head. The opportunity here is space and bigness and dynamic range and openness. And the more it tries to get closed in, the less spatial it becomes and the more mono it is. So there's a relationship, as always, with mastering engineers and mix engineers about how to best move things forward. And sitting in a tuned room and in a place that gives unbiased opinion and unbiased perspective is a valuable relationship, not only for the artist and the engineers with the mastering engineer, but how the consumers are going to hear this across different devices. Many of us are mixing in only one room and only one space. And how do we translate that to the outside world? So that's a quick overview.
Yeah.
I hope that helped clarify a little bit.
Absolutely. And we feel strongly and passionately about this. And again, how some may have seen this from a necessity perspective at the beginning, which was, never our representation of it, but we're thrilled to see the evolution of this process being kind of righted. And everything that Michael said we would reinforce, and Carrie has done in multiple sessions with several of you participating as well. So I'm going to stop there simply for time, but just to say that we could go on for a very, very long time about how emphatic we feel about the importance of that process.
It's huge. I've been doing, and I would say, I even said at the beginning, I've been mastering in Atmos for 3 years, but I know that I've been doing it longer than that because I've been working with Dolby and testing algorithms and testing, what do things sound like, and how is this, the tools that you're working with. Props to you guys. Thank you for including engineers in the discovery or the process of building the tools. So it's not theoretical; it's actually practical.
I appreciate that, but we more than value it. It's inherent in our DNA at Dolby to build with all of you. So we appreciate your feedback. We more than welcome it. We need your feedback, and we want to build solutions that work for everyone. Okay, there's also another fundamental question here that I think is really important. Lauren Moore asks, please break down Dolby mixing from a big picture perspective. What is the difference between stereo mixing and Dolby mixing? I would have loved to see an actual example of a song mixed in Dolby to see it in action. Oof, but then you've got someone's secret sauce and there's all kinds of permissions we have to get on this thing. But the point is taken. No, but the point is taken, and I think we should. Let's just step back and talk about what is Dolby Atmos mixing.
Yeah. So, Dolby Atmos, because it's not and I hate to say terms that may be construed as negative, but it's not confined to the limitations of stereo, right? Stereo, you've got two channels that you're trying to create a sound field, a staging in, and you do have the challenges of masking of frequencies and all of those things that need to be considered in that. By giving mixers the ability to actually move things out of the way, and to quote Steve Genowick, we're not trying to shove 25 pounds of shit into a 10-pound bag. So we're in a situation where you have more freedom to actually explore and maintain the essence of those instruments. So if you start in Atmos and work your way down, you've got the high resolution image, you've got the 4K Ultra HD picture that then can be crafted into something that is capable of reproducing effectively on stereo as well. So that's the benefit of mixing in Atmos versus mixing in stereo.
And this is a good point to just say. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, sorry, Chris. If you had a point to his, I was going to add to something to the mixing side of things as a consideration is one thing to consider, and back to the 25 pounds, in a 5-pound bag. I think of this the other way is, and I use this a lot, is my favorite version of Sgt. Pepper is the mono version. And after extensive listening to all of them, what's coming out of one speaker is genius to get all those sounds to work like that. But that's knowing the delivery mechanism and how the instruments and content are going to represent themselves. If you took all of those instruments and then started moving them around, they would not necessarily be as piano-like or guitar-like or sonic-like, because they are occupying a different space. So merely pulling things apart doesn't satisfy the stems thing, doesn't really create a mix in the same way that the art form of creating a sensory experience around you, that you have the opportunity to use that space to bring the listener in actively. It's a different, you're not trying to do this. It's a different perspective, and it's a different process than just spreading things around.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple quick notes. One, we've been asked for if we could repost the best practices QR code, and I think overall it's the resources that you really need access to. So I'm just going to speak to that for a second. As a follow-up, we're certainly happy to communicate a list of resources that we know are frequently requested. I think that's a great mail for you all to have in your hands. I want to be clear that on the learning.dolby.com, professional.dolby.com websites, etc., there are deep knowledge bases. They're everything from 2-minute quick start videos where you can literally watch someone's hands executing on a keyboard with a mouse. There are representations by creatives who are working in the industry, and there are deep documents available too. So really all bite-sized and long form. I'm going to do a little speed dating round very quickly just to touch on a couple of topics, and there are going to be some gaps in what we can address here. There are several questions about future forward-looking, if you will, future progress with some of our tools partners. It is not appropriate for Dolby to represent what future releases will include with our partners. And so many of you do participate in those beta groups. What I would encourage you to do is reach out if you'd like to participate in one of our beta groups or in the beta groups with our tools partners. And we're very happy to communicate with you offline. I believe I'll get a report of all the questions asked here today, and they will not go unanswered. So just in terms of speed dating, a couple of things that those don't address. There is a question around, the new logic. I just want to address this one because I think something we can come right to the end of it. So do you know if Apple's feeding the 714 DAR render into their spatialization, or do they create a real-time DD plus JOC plus QAR, plus OAR? Sorry, I can't, sorry, my mistake, plus 714, and then feed that into their codec. Again, we can address this if it's something that's public. Otherwise, we would point you to their documentation. Can we address this, Kerry?
Yeah, so they're not doing a real-time DD plus JOC encode, as you kind of allude to there. It is very much the same, or what's happening on their device, which is 714. Virtualized room decode into their spatial audio rendering engine, and that's what That's what's being referred to in the Apple renderer. So you can either listen to the Apple renderer fixed or the Apple renderer head tracked, just as you can with the decoded Dolby Atmos signal on iOS devices. But the workflow that was described in the and I posted it in the chat in the article will allow you to get 714 into Logic and then into their spatial audio rendering if you're using Monterey. So take a look at that, and excited to see developments of all of the tool sets going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. Absolutely incredible discussion with you, and appreciate the time and again, attention of everyone here within the P&E wing, and look forward to future sessions.
Christine, thank you so much. And I really want to just say thank you. Actually, I was just about to bring Maureen back and she came back. I want to make sure she jumped on. Thank you, Carrie and Christine, for putting this on, for agreeing to spend some time and answer some questions. I know folks have some deeper questions. We have more sessions coming up. So I also, want to say stick around and tune in for the next ones. We're going to get into room tuning and configurations, creation solutions, formats, metadata, learning, education, support, a whole bunch of other topics in subsequent ones of these. And so, Carrie, thank you for your time. Christine, thank you for your time. You guys are awesome. Maureen, Candace, and Jane, you guys are fantastic. And thank you for allowing this format to be able to serve our members this way and have these types of discussions where we can really dig in a little bit and open up some understanding. So thank you so much, Maureen.